We're going to get started now. Thank you for your patience. I'm Tim Christ. I'm president of the Newark History Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight. We have some good news to pass along. The first is I'm happy to display this award of recognition that the New Jersey Historical Commission presented to the Newark History Society at its annual gathering just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we're very pleased. We heard some good news today. I think a number of you know that we launched the Newark Archives Project, which Gail Malmgreen is really taking the lead on. We learned today that we got a $10,000 grant from the Delmos Foundation in New York, which is a foundation that focuses on libraries and archival work, so that's a really great vote of confidence. We have a couple other proposals out there as we complete the second year of our first phase, kind of the test phase, and boy, Gail, we have found so much stuff about Newark. Having done the City Archives, the New Jersey Historical Society, the Newark Museum, and now at the Newark Public Library, the goal is to keep spreading out through Newark, Essex County, and even across state lines. But that's going to take some substantial funding. We have been talking for a long time about getting websites up and running. We're getting closer. Maybe by the next time, for our next meeting in February, we'll be able to say that we have a Newark History Society website up, and maybe even a Newark Archives Project website up. Bob Hartman, who I don't think is here, but just sent me the mock-up for the tributes that were given to at the event on the 14th to John Cunningham. We're going to put those on the website along with other things, but that's coming. The other thing is coming is our membership renewals. We are nearly 200 members strong, and Warren, for his sins, takes responsibility for getting that mailing out, and your support is really important to us. As most of you know, we are an all-volunteer organization. And if you were not on our mailing list, there were some slips by membership forms by the food, and please pick one up if you're not getting our notices. I think that's enough of an introduction for this evening, which leaves only introducing Warren, who I think is very well known to most of you. He is the author of the acclaimed Nazis in Newark, and I think at least one of our guests tonight brought a copy to be signed, Mr. Parsonet. But more important to us, really a key player in the creation and development of the Newark History Society, and really the driving force behind the Newark Archives Project. Warren is a first-rate historian, a great advocate of things Newark, and we're really fortunate that he is here to talk to us tonight about the Newark Communist Party, 1919 to the New Deal. Warren?
Importantly, I want to start the stopwatch. Well, we were canceled out October 29th, but when I think back, that was an inauspicious evening to have an event, knowing that it was the onset of the Great Depression, the great stock market crash, on October 29th, 1929. I want to thank for the visuals, Gail, and of course James Lewis from the Newark Public Library. One Sunday morning in August 1919, residents of Newark's Ironbound were surprised to find under their doors circulars denouncing America and its capitalist society and advocating the overthrow of the government. This was Newark's first recorded communist activity in the city and probably in the state. According to the Newark Sunday Call, the circulars were delivered by the Russian Workers' Party, operating unimpeded in the city. They had delivered the flyers in the neighborhood. The Ironbound at the time housed 303 industrial establishments and was populated largely by families of Slavic origin, 20,000 of them being Russian. In fact, the Ironbound then was known as Little Russia. The Ironbound suffered from both high rates of literacy and non-citizenship. Inspired by the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the American Communist Party, known in its early years as the Workers' Party, was established in the spring of 1919 and was soon organized in a host of American cities. It got its start after the American Socialist Party expelled 7 foreign language branches for advocating a Bolshevik revolution in America. These branches totaled 40,000 members, and that provided the core of the American Communist Party. Socialist and radical activities had been part of Newark's political landscape for many decades. The Marxist Socialist Labor Party under Eugene Debs had an influential presence in the city and in the Newark labor movement. Italian anarchists, Russian Marxists from the failed 1905 revolution, German socialists from the failed 1848 revolution were all potential sources for the Communist Party. So too were Eastern European Jews, who belonged to Newark's more than 25 Yiddish-speaking workmen's circle branches. Since the end of the 19th century, the workmen's circle had provided working-class Jews with cemetery space, health, welfare, and educational programs. Each branch or lodge represented either a trade or a town of origin in Russia, or Poland. When the Socialist Party split in 1919, a 7-year conflict ensued between the socialist and communist factions of the Workmen's Circle. With its many Socialist Party foreign language branches, Newark became an early center of communist activity. Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and others formed Workers' Party units, each with its own leader, each with its own office. These groups, although allied with the new Communist Party, were largely autonomous. However, they shared a common desire for immediate revolution by force. The Russian branch was the largest and most active in Newark. In 1919, federal, state, and local police agencies were just winding down from 5 years of countering German anti-American activities. Newark was no stranger to this battleground. It possessed a large, influential, and well-organized German-American population. Although only a small fraction of this German-American population had been engaged in pro-German activities during the war, anti-German hysteria ran deep in the city, resulting in the renaming of German streets, the elimination of the German language classes in high schools, and widespread discrimination, especially in employment. When World War I ended, the same police agencies that dealt with German anti-American activities easily morphed into anti-communist squads, and many of them started creating files on Workers' Party members. In 1919, the anarchists proved to be more dangerous than the communists. On June 2nd, 1919, bombs exploded in 8 cities, including Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington. The plot was hatched by a small group of Italian anarchists. The bombs were intended for prominent government officials. One bomb, of course, was set off at the home of United States Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. It killed the bomber, but did no harm to Palmer. Within 10 days, the Attorney General appeared before Congress to request a $500,000 appropriation to hunt for anarchists, bomb throwers, and enemies of law and order. A $300,000 appropriation was granted, but 5 months later, Congress chided Palmer on the lack of results. He handed the investigation over to a 24-year-old named J. Edgar Hoover. He didn't fare much better. The anarchists were nowhere to be found. In fact, they had escaped the country and to this day have never been prosecuted or even positively identified. Under pressure from Palmer, Hoover ordered his agents to make mass arrests of members of the Russian Workers' Party, the group most closely identified with armed insurrection. On the evening of November 9th, 1919, federal and local agents raided party offices in 18 cities, including Newark. 72 men were arrested. Palmer took credit for the raid, claiming he forestalled an action planned for the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, adding that all aliens engaged in radical activities would be deported to Russia. 5 Newarkers, in fact, were deported. The raids were considered a success, and Hoover planned a larger crackdown. The Palmer raids began January 2nd, 1920, and lasted for 4 days. Throughout the country, over 5,000 arrests were made in 33 cities. In Newark, 74 people were arrested and sent to Ellis Island. 32 were detained more than a week, all of them Russian Workers' Party officials from the 2 Newark branches. One on Charlton Street in the 3rd Ward and the other on Adams Street in the Ironbound. Almost all those in custody had Slavic surnames. At the Adams Street branch, police seized 2 black flags with lettering that read, "The spirit of destruction is the spirit of a new life." As well were seized large portraits of Lenin and Trotsky. According to the police, a bomb was discovered hidden in the building's outhouse. 2 months later, the Department of Justice, with the assistance of the Newark police, sent 100 agents to raid a dance in the 3rd Ward. They had arrest warrants for 25 radicals, none of whom was at the dance. Yet, the agents arrested 12 men and 1 woman. The Newark News mocked the raid as espionage overdone. The newspaper asked, could any form of propaganda against the United States be worse than these very acts of lawlessness perpetrated in its name? The Palmer raids and other police action throughout the country forced the communists in America to convert their party into a conspiratorial organization. Out of fear of deportation and/or arrest, thousands of communists left the party. Those who remained committed to the cause went underground and met privately. For almost 2 years, the communists ceased open activities. At the end of 1921, competing factions of the party agreed to operate in the open, but to continue working underground as well. Decisions of the party would be made in private, but the party would work within existing labor unions to gain leadership without enunciating their ultimate aim of revolution through force of arms. With few exceptions, from 1920 to 1923, there was little communist activity in Newark. Despite this, Commissioner William Brennan emerged during these years as a staunch foe of the radicals. Brennan was a labor leader active in the state AFL. He was elected to the first city commission in 1917 and subsequently re-elected 3 times, serving as Commissioner for Public Safety. As Newark's highest police authority, he thwarted communist activities by denying meeting permits and arresting those who tried to speak. Defending the rights of Newark's communists was the mission of the American Civil Liberties Union. Founded by Roger Baldwin in 1920 in response to the Palmer raids, the Union defended civil liberties, particularly the rights of speech, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. It was a successor to the Civil Liberties Union of 1917, which had performed the same functions for World War I conscientious objectors and dissenters. In 1921, Brennan and the ACLU were at odds over a rally for Sacco and Vanzetti, a leftist cause célèbre. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists accused of murdering 2 payroll guards during a holdup in South Braintree, Massachusetts. Communist, anarchist, labor, and other sympathizers held rallies and fundraisers for the 2 defendants from their 1921 trial and conviction through appeals and right up to their 1927 executions. The Newark rally was scheduled for Laurel Gardens. It was sponsored by an Italian anarchist group and the Labor Education Society, an ad hoc group primarily composed of communists. Brennan ordered the Newark police to cancel the rally. He said, "This is not the sort of meeting for Newark." The sponsors asked the ACLU to intervene. Roger Baldwin sent a representative to Newark to confer with Mayor Charles Gillen and other city officials. Gillen overruled Brennan, declaring that the event should be rescheduled. But it was too late. The speakers had gone across the country appearing at other rallies, and the Newark rally was never held. In 1923, Newark's communists took on a higher profile, establishing branches of National Party adjuncts. That year, the Newark branch of the International Labor Defense, or the ILD, was created to raise money to cover bail and legal defense for jailed communists. William Foster, the head of the National ILD, was scheduled to be the speaker at the Newark branch's initial meeting at the Iroquois Hall on Washington Street. Brennan canceled the meeting and told Foster to leave Newark. William Z. Foster was first a socialist, then an IWW member, then a syndicalist, an anarchist, and at the end of World War I became a labor organizer. He joined the Communist Party in 1921, became party secretary in 1929. A Stalin loyalist, he remained in the top position until 1957. The Young Communist League, an adjunct organized to attract younger members to the party, also opened a branch in Newark in 1923. The local group had about 10 members. With Yiddish, its lingua franca. And in the same year, the party newspaper, The Worker, later The Daily Worker, opened its first office outside of New York, right here in Newark. Newark communists became involved in local labor unions, particularly with carpenters and painters. Jews were active in both trades, having acquired the training in Eastern Europe, where most shtetl houses were built of wood. A housing boom that dates to well before World War I and continued through the 1920s witnessed the rise of wooden tenement buildings, first in the 3rd Ward, then Lower Clinton Hill, Vailsburg, and finally in Weequahic, where instead of tenements you had 1, 2, and 4 family wood houses. The need for carpenters and painters was evident. Many of these workers spoke Yiddish and belonged to the workmen's circle branches of their trades. The working conditions, long hours, low pay, safety hazards, and exposure to toxic chemicals demanded strong unions to deal with the predatory contractors. Carpenters and painters joined the AFL unions for protection, but formed their own Yiddish-speaking locals. Local 577 of the Painters Union was founded by Samuel Winograd, president of the Workmen's Circle Painters Lodge. He joined the Communist Party in 1919, subsequently founding Local 777. Local 24, the Carpenters, likewise had its origins as a Workmen's Circle Lodge, and in 1923 became affiliated with the Communist Party. Both of these locals were small, fewer than 50 men in each. Communist influence was also present in the sign painters and in the cleaners and dyers locals, but these were short-lived. Newark was the second largest fur processing center in the country, and A. Hollander and Sons Fur Company on East Kinney Street was the largest fur processor in the world, at one time employing almost 7,000 people. The International Fur Workers Union, Local 25, had organized all the other fur shops in Newark except Hollander. Communists were active in both the international and the local from the 1920s through the 1950s. Morris Langer was the leading figure in the Newark local until his assassination in 1933. Langer began working as a fur dresser at Hollander in 1910 at the age of 15. In 1913, he joined the newly formed International Fur Workers Union. He became active in union affairs and was elected vice president of Local 25 in 1920. Starting as a socialist, he joined the Communist Party in 1925. There were only about 20 communists in Local 25 out of a total of 125 members. But almost the entire membership was loyal to Langer. Through 1929, Langer was active only peripherally in the Newark Party, spending most of his time organizing fur workers in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. In 1929, Local 25 was about 70% Jewish and 25% Italian. Greeks belonged to the Newark Communist Party. Influential in the restaurant trade, Greeks owned and staffed almost all of Newark's downtown restaurants. Working conditions were inhuman: 7-day weeks, 12 to 14-hour days, hard tile floors and stuffy kitchens. Lung and kidney diseases were prevalent. The meager wages were usually paid monthly. Most workers were flat-footed, and many suffered from kidney ailments and consumption. The Greek unit of the Newark Communist Party made 3 attempts to organize Newark restaurants in the 1920s, and all failed. In 1926, the Communists organized a 17-week strike of over 350 workers, almost succeeded, but the owners obtained a court injunction prohibiting picketing. Years later, the Greek restaurants were organized, but not by the Communists. 1923 was a year of organization building, and by 1924, the Newark Party was in the open and ready to gain new adherents. After William Foster was denied the right to speak in Newark on behalf of the ILD in 1923, in January 1924 he tried again, and to make a point, he chose to hold a rally at the corner of Broad and Market Streets, Newark's busiest intersection. Although he was denied a permit, he appeared all the same, and was arrested after his first words. The ACLU filed a $30,000 civil suit for false arrest. The following month, the ACLU and the ILD sponsored a joint rally at Broad Market again, with Foster as a speaker. A permit was denied. Thus, in a span of 6 months, Foster made 3 unsuccessful attempts to speak in Newark. At one point, Commissioner Brennan said to Foster, "You can't talk in Newark, not while we run this town." Soon after, Newark communists applied for and were denied a permit to hold a Lenin Memorial rally at the Labor Lyceum on South 14th Street. The building is still there. Consequently, they decided to hold the event outdoors in front of the Lyceum. The 4 speakers included prominent New York communists. As each began to speak, he was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Director Brennan and the Newark police had no intention of allowing communists either freedom of speech or assembly. Mayor Frederick Breidenbach and Commissioners Thomas Raymond and Charles Gillen agreed it was time to rein in Brennan and the police department. The negative publicity that Newark was getting nationally was the reason. When ACLU lawyer John Larkin Hughes suggested a meeting at which he, the police, Newark officials, and the defense counsel work out a plan that would allow communists to meet unmolested by the police, the Newark officials readily agreed. The meeting was a watershed event for communist activity in Newark. An agreement stipulated that a permit would be issued for any communist event, providing that the party's name and the purpose of the event was on the application. For the next 3 years plus, there was virtually no police repression of communist events. In November, Newark's communists held a large rally, their first of the year, commemorating the 7th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Most Newark communists were still immigrants. Of the rally's 3 speakers, 2 spoke Yiddish and 1 German. However, change was in the air. The following month, an English-speaking branch of the Young Communist League was created for the purpose of attracting second-generation Americans to the communist fold. The League's first program was on the ABCs of communism. This branch grew steadily and became a fertile recruiting arm through the 1930s. During 1925 and 1926, national and local prosperity, as well as the fractured nature of the Newark Communist Party, hampered both its growth and its activities. In 1925, there were only 200 dues-paying party members in the city. And the city had 8 foreign language branches: Jewish, German, Russian, Polish, Greek, Finnish, Hungarian, and Ukrainian. 200 members split into all those groups. Most Communist Party events were held at the Labor Lyceum, which was owned by the Workmen's Circle. They included membership meetings, educational events, rallies, and dances. By the mid-20s, most of the foreign language branches of Newark's party met there also. Until 1932, it's important to note, the Newark Communist Party was a district of New York. It had no professional staff. A succession of individuals served as party secretary on a part-time basis, receiving a small stipend, usually $5 a week. Party minutes from New York District 2 disclose official frustration at the seeming chaos in Newark. To correct this, New York ordered a general membership meeting in August 1925 at the Labor Lyceum. All foreign language branches were ordered to attend. Pleas were made in several languages for the members of the branches to obey the orders of the New York Party Secretariat. A month later, Bertram Wolfe, the national communist leader and its leading theoretician, attended another meeting in Newark to lecture party leaders on their doctrinal errors. He urged the Newark comrades to travel to New York to learn more about the current party line. During 1926, efforts continued to unify the disparate elements of the Newark Communist Party. It was a slow but steady progression as foreign speakers learned English, and a second generation of communists chose not to affiliate with the foreign language branches. The Young Communist League was not surprisingly the most active adjunct of the party. In 1927, the Secretariat of the Communist Party sent S.D. Levine to Newark to help manage the party and build the circulation of the Freiheit, a Yiddish communist daily established in 1922. Levine, 42, was an experienced journalist who had spent the war years in Newark writing for the Forward, the Yiddish language socialist newspaper. He became a communist in 1919, was sent to Boston to manage a forerunner of the Freiheit. He displayed managerial skill in Boston and was transferred to Newark. Levine's work in Newark was significant. During his 7 years in the city, he covered all local stories for the Freiheit with a passion and with a trenchant wit. However, it was not as a journalist that he made his mark in Newark. Levine had been sent there to energize and bring unity to the party. His arrival in Newark coincided with the communist defection from the workmen's circle in late 1927. After a number of bitter disputes, the communists left and rented their own space at 93 Mercer Street. With its own headquarters and growing confidence, the party and its adjuncts began to hold numerous events to educate the people and gain new adherents. The communists grew bolder and returned to Broad Market streets for speech-making. The majority of commissioners saw to it that they received police protection from the many hecklers, to the dismay of Public Safety Commissioner Brennan. Until November, over a dozen meetings and rallies were peacefully held throughout the central city. However, on the 10th anniversary celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution, Irving Maitland received a permit to hold a November 10th meeting at the Ukrainian Hall at 57 Beacon Street. The purpose of the meeting was not listed on the application, nor the name Communist Party. However, when street circulars advertising the event disclosed it was communist sponsored, Newark Police Chief McCrell revoked the permit. Although 300 people appeared at the hall, they could not enter. The locked doors were guarded by police. The crowd decided to hold a rally in front of the hall. When the first speaker opened his mouth, he was arrested, as were the 6 men who followed him. Among those arrested was Louis Jaffe, a leader of the Carpenters Union and Morris Ranger's closest friend. The arrestees were charged as disorderly persons because there was no permit for the event. Total bond was set at $950 for the 7 men. The Newark Communist Party issued a statement decrying the denial of their constitutional freedoms of speech and assembly. It added that Newark was the only city in the country that interfered with the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The ILD and the ACLU denounced the arrests. John Larkin Hughes again came to Newark and met with Chief McCrell, who told him the communists had violated the agreement made 3 years earlier by omitting to disclose that the Communist Party was a sponsor of the event. After lengthy negotiations, a new agreement was reached. Communist events would be allowed if all publicity was submitted to the Newark Police Department 8 days before the event. Once again, the agreement held for 2 years, although the heightened visibility of the communists caused increasing unease in Newark's establishment. The New Jersey Law Journal opined on the communist threat. American values are being threatened by pacifists, the ACLU, and various disgruntled intellectuals, particularly from the Communist Party. These threats include birth control and free love. Both Communist Party ideas to disintegrate family life. More specifically, the writer complained that Young Communist League had been picketing and handing out circulars at Barringer, East Side, West Side, and Central high schools against citizens' military training camps, which provided physical training for young men because so many were unfit to fight in World War I. The circulars and the picket signs claimed the camp's food was rotten and the boys were being taught to be strikebreakers and cannon fodder. Despite concern about communist activity in Newark, the real strength of the party can be judged by the vote in the 1928 presidential election. The Communist Party ticket of William Z. Foster and Benjamin Gitlow, it polled only 350 votes out of a total of 120,000 cast in the city. Undeterred by this poor showing, Newark Communists opted to run candidates for the May 1929 City Commission election. They fielded 3 candidates for the 5 positions. S.D. Levine, the best known of the 3, ran with the slogan, "Equality for Negro Workers." He polled 1,909 votes, more than the total statewide Communist Party vote in the 1928 presidential election. The Daily Worker trumpeted that most of Levine's vote came from blacks. This wasn't true. An analysis of the vote shows that most of Levine's votes came from the Jewish voters and only 144 came from the black districts of the 3rd Ward. In 1919, Newark's black population was 17,000. By mid-1929, it had more than doubled. During this period, to my knowledge, there was not a single dues-paying black member of the Newark Communist Party. On the national level, the International Labor Defender, the monthly periodical, the communist-run ILD, featured 291 articles on political repression in the United States from 1926 through 29. Only 16 were on blacks. So there was no black emphasis in the Communist Party on blacks, either in Newark or in the country. This would change. At the Cleveland Convention in August 1929 of the United States Communist Party, there was created the Trade Union Unity League, or TUUL. It was created partly to organize marginal populations of workers, women, the unemployed, and blacks. The TUUL directive to recruit more women was already underway in Newark. For several years, the Young Communist League had successfully recruited women from Newark high schools, especially from Central and South Side. Many of the recruits had parents who were either Communist Party members or sympathizers. The best-known YCL leader was Lottie Blumenthal, her high school picture. Daughter of Samuel Blumenthal, a successful hardware merchant on Mulberry Street. Lottie became a leader of the Young Communist League and one of its chief activists in Newark and in New Jersey. After her marriage, Lottie Gordon was active on the national level. When she died less than a decade ago, she was a librarian at the Communist Party headquarters in Manhattan. The Jack London Club, established in mid-1929, was a literary discussion group that attracted bright, young high school and college students and was open to all. A poorly kept secret was that the club was a complete adjunct of the Newark Communist Party. In fact, its meeting room was on the 2nd floor of Cantor's Furniture Store on the corner of Spruce and Prince Streets. The only other office on the second floor was that of the Young Communist League. Almost all the people I interviewed spoke very highly of the Jack London Club. To help organize the unemployed, the party sent a young but very experienced organizers to Newark in 1929. Dominic Fliani was an Italian immigrant who had come to the United States when he was a child and was fluent in both English and Italian. His first job was as a fur processor in Brooklyn. It was there that he joined the Communist Party and became an activist. Fliani was soon transferred to Philadelphia, where he remained 5 years. He became a leading communist in the city and a special target of the Philadelphia police. At one point, he was arrested 5 times in 6 days. After being charged with sedition, his lawyers got the charge dropped in return for his departure from the city. That's how Newark got Fliani. A new phase in the history of the Newark Communist Party began in 1930 with the Great Depression. Growing unemployment and the concomitant dissatisfaction with the capitalist system created a burgeoning interest in alternative social experiences. Whittaker Chambers said about the appeal of communism during the Depression, "The vision inspires, the crisis impels." In late 1930, the Newark News published its first big story on unemployment in Newark. City Welfare Commissioner John Murray called a conference of welfare workers to discuss measures to alleviate the city's unemployment crisis. Already 30,000 workers were unemployed. He said an emergency would soon occur. The American Communist Party had been more prescient than the Newark City Fathers. Several months before the October stock market crash, the party set up unemployment councils. Less than a week after Murray's welfare conference, Newark's communists announced the creation of the Newark Unemployed Council, with Dominic Fliani as its head. In early February 1930, an organizational meeting of the unemployed took place at the communist headquarters on Mercer Street, with over 300 people in attendance, half of them black. Fliani led a discussion on ways of bringing jobless demands to the attention of the bosses and their government. The next meeting was scheduled for February 11th. Newark Commissioner and Public Safety Director William Brennan was at the meeting. Concerned about the communist attempt to organize blacks, Brennan quickly engineered a counterattack. He spearheaded the enactment of a new policy that authorized police to prevent or disband any unemployed meetings, to arrest and prosecute communists propagandizing blacks, and to use physical force to subdue any resistance to his policies. Like Brennan, 4th Precinct Police Judge Nicholas Albano was fiercely anti-communist. In advance of the February 11th unemployed meeting, he issued warrants for known communist leaders who were likely to attend. On the night of the meeting, as the hall filled up, 20 plainclothes police armed with warrants sat in the packed room, and another 40 uniformed police stood outside. Over 500 attendees were there. They heard President Hoover referred to as Wall Street's messenger boy, and New Jersey Governor Morgan Larson called indifferent to the plight of the unemployed. At a signal, the police moved to the front of the hall, arrested the speakers and 8 others on the dais, ordered the audience to leave. Those arrested included Langer, Levine, Fliani, and Dozier Grain. Grain, 63 years old, was a mild-mannered retired minister who days before had joined the Unemployed Council. He was disabled and needed a cane to walk. Also arrested was 18-year-old Sylvia Ostrow, a young Communist League member who had been handing out flyers advertising the rally outside the hall. The 9 men were held on $10,000 bail each. Unbelievably high amount for the time. Ostrow was held for $1,000. S.D. Levine described the subsequent events in the Yiddish Freiheit. We were all loaded on the patrol wagon and taken to the 4th Precinct station. The other arrestees were taken into the station, but I was pushed into the wall of the garage by a policeman twice my size, who punched me in the face and the stomach. When I fell to the ground, he kicked me. After he rested, he resumed punching me. When my face was swelled up, he was satisfied. I was taken into the station, but was not placed with the other prisoners, so they couldn't see my face. The newspapers said I was injured falling down the steps. At the arraignment the next morning, Albano didn't mince words. If you people are dissatisfied with this country, go back where you came from. All were charged under a 1902 New Jersey sedition law that carried a maximum sentence of 15 years. In explaining the much lower bail for Sylvia Ostrow, Albano opined, apparently the girl has not been spanked enough while she was growing up. Wow. He added that a higher bail would be inappropriate because she was still in her formative years. In an editorial, the Star Eagle attacked the police for brutality and Albano for setting such a high bail. The paper said that the police had helped Red propaganda and that the language used by the communists in Newark was no worse than that used in the United States Senate. The men remained in jail, unable to make bail. Ostrow's father bailed her out that day. However, she was arrested almost immediately when she began handing out circulars protesting the high bail for the other prisoners. She then appeared before Judge Harold Simandl, who, concurring with Albano, ordered Sylvia and her father back to court in 2 days, at which time he told Mr. Ostrow to spank his daughter in the courtroom. The Newark News called the punishment savage, and prominent citizens and clergy vigorously protested. Simandl, who apparently had not thought through the sentence, was said to be embarrassed. He called Sylvia back into his chambers the next morning and tried to get her to recant her actions. She laughed at him. The judge was forced by public opinion to set her free. 1 week after the arrests, Abraham Isserman, ILD lawyer and a secret communist, asked County Judge Walter Van Riper to reduce the bail from $10,000 to $3,000. Isserman was a 30-year-old Newark civil rights lawyer who over his long career was best known for his defense of communists. As unemployment deepened, evictions for non-payment of rent increased. Since party headquarters was in the 3rd Ward, communists were often on the scene as soon as they heard of an eviction. They summoned neighbors, drew a crowd, made speeches, and led loud marches through the neighborhood holding protest signs. The first of these protests was the most publicized because of the harsh police and judicial action against the perpetrators. Levinson Grant, a widower with 5 children, lost his job at Christmas. He couldn't pay the rent and the family was evicted from their house at 19 Livingston Street. The communists were forewarned and were at Grant's house with protest signs at the ready, stating, "Worker wages, stop the eviction." They demanded immediate reinstatement to the family. A crowd of 200 soon gathered and began to march down Livingston Street. The police arrived and demanded the marchers halt. The communists refused. Policemen waded into the crowd and beat the marchers back with nightsticks. The 4 organizers were taken to the 4th Precinct Police Court, where Judge Albano charged them with loitering and disorderly conduct. Bail was set at $100 each. 2 days later, the men were brought for trial before Albano. He found them guilty and sentenced each to 90 days in jail. For good measure, he increased their bail to $250. In sentencing, the men, Albano said, "I am not here to decide the virtues or evils of communism, but to maintain peace and quiet in this precinct. You came to preach to certain persons who have not the intellect to understand and who may misinterpret. Here is where the danger lies." The ACLU again intervened. Roger Baldwin came to Newark to set up a local committee due to the ill-conceived police drive against communists. The committee included prominent clergymen, defense attorneys, and police. An agreement was reached to allow street meetings as long as all municipal ordinances were obeyed. The agreement was useless, as the police could halt any event on the grounds that it was blocking traffic, and indeed they did. Clearly frustrated, the ACLU decided to attack the issue of freedom of speech and assembly in Newark by creating a test case they would appeal right up to the United States Supreme Court. In mid-July, the ACLU sent 4 carefully briefed, elegantly attired professors, 2 each from Columbia and New York University. They came to Newark to hold a street meeting. They hoped to be arrested, but were warned ahead of time to avoid being arrested for blocking traffic. The meeting was held on Springfield Avenue and Broome Street at the center of the black neighborhood in the 3rd Ward. Before the proceedings even began, the police arrested party member Saul Stark for handing out leaflets advertising the event. ACLU lawyer Nunn mounted a soapbox and began to introduce the speakers. 3rd Ward Police Chief Captain Fose ordered him to stop. Nunn said he represented the ACLU and that the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and assembly. Fose said he was not there to engage in a constitutional debate. While this discussion was going on, a squad of 10 policemen was telling the rapidly growing crowd to move on. Alexander Taylor, Public Relations Director for the ACLU, did not move quickly enough and found himself in the same paddy wagon as Saul Stark. The two are a study in contrasts. Stark in shabby pants and a torn shirt, and Taylor immaculately dressed in a light tan golf suit and knickers. Nunn again mounted a soapbox and was told he faced arrest for obstructing traffic. He knew that was a no-no and suggested reassembling at a vacant coal yard a half a block away. The crowd had now swelled to over 500. It followed Nunn into the coal yard. One of the professors yelled through a bullhorn, "Step right in, ladies and gentlemen. 4 college professors will offer a complete education in one evening, free of charge." Nunn began his introductions, prompting Fose to telephone Chief McCrell, who ordered him to make no arrests. Newark needed no more bad publicity. Each professor, not knowing about this phone call, stepped up to address the audience. Each asked to be arrested, but to their chagrin, none of them were. Commissioner Brennan died in May 1930, and his protege, William Egan, was appointed to replace him. A Union man, Egan had served as city clerk before his elevation. An active Democrat, he eventually became Essex County Democratic chairman. Egan's first directive as public safety director was issued after the ACLU fiasco. He prohibited further test case meetings and warned the ACLU that any attempt at such a meeting would be met with arrests for disturbing the peace. The ACLU then abandoned Newark communists to Egan and McCrell. The party was left to its own devices as it continued efforts to organize the unemployed and gain black members. Knowing that they could no longer hold street meetings, Newark communists now turned to Military Park. During the next 3 years, 2 memorable events took place there. The first was an unemployment demonstration to coincide with similar ones being held in large cities throughout the world. The press dubbed the event Red Thursday. The rally started at noon, with about 100 communists and sympathizers, plus several thousand spectators. The speaker's stand was in front of the Wars of America monument. 60 police were in the park with 300 in reserve. The workers on lunch from both public service and American life insurance watched the proceedings from the windows and roofs of their buildings, which adjoined at that time Military Park. Speakers included Fleani Levine and Leonard Patterson, a newly recruited black member of the Young Communist League. Levine attacked the police brutality. Fleani called for a Bolshevik regime. As Patterson started to speak, boos came from 60-odd workers on the roofs. The rally ended with a list of demands, including jobs, no evictions, more relief for the unemployed. Throughout the event, many of the spectators laughed and razzed the speakers. The second event on May Day was May Day. It was also held at the War of America's monument. It was scheduled at 1 p.m. to escape the lunch hour catcalls. The rally was significant because for the first time in the history of Newark, red flags of revolution were unfurled in Newark. The largest flag had the hammer and sickle and the word Newark on it. The speakers heard harangues against capitalism and praise for the Soviet Union. Lottie Blumenthal, 17 of the YCL, spoke on the evils of capitalism and the oppression of blacks in Newark. When the rally ended, communists started to parade back to their Mercer Street headquarters, red flags flying. They had no permit for the parade. The police stepped in, using the opportunity to seize the communist flags and to tear them up. In late May 1930, the first of the trials for the 9 men arrested at the February unemployment rally began. Actually, only 3 trials took place. Those of Fleani and Levine for sedition and Dozier Graham for incitement to riot. Fleani's was the first and most sensational, making the front pages of Newark papers and the front section of the New York Times. The prosecution charged that Fleani argued for an overthrow of the government and urged blacks to commit criminal acts. When the defense tried to depose their witnesses, Van Riper prohibited from doing so because the witnesses declared they were atheists and refused to swear on the Bible. In a later trial, S.T. Levine's witnesses were also disqualified for the same reason. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Fleani guilty of sedition for urging the destruction of the United States government by force. Levine was also found guilty of sedition shortly thereafter. After the verdict, the prosecutor spoke of deporting Fleani to Italy. Judge Van Riper said he was undecided. The next day, Newark's most influential Protestant and Jewish clergyman met with Van Riper, pleading with him to show leniency to the 26-year-old Fleani. What Fleani said, they argued, would only be a crime if violence resulted. None had. And Van Riper was again asked to please show mercy. He was non-committal. Morris Langer issued a statement denouncing the clergyman's intercession and declaring that Fleani, an atheist, had not asked for their help. He added a comment that could hardly help his comrade's case. Langer said, "If the communists have their way, there'll be no ministers to go anywhere for anybody." A week later, Dozier Graham, now a candidate for the United States Senate, was tried for incitement to riot. He was convicted in less than a half hour, sentenced to 7 years. But once again, political powers had the judge, after 2 days, make the judge suspend the sentence. The ACLU appealed both Fliani and Levine's verdicts to the New Jersey Supreme Court on the grounds that Van Riper had refused to let the defendant's witnesses appear. The trial to the other 6 men, including Langer, were postponed awaiting the Supreme Court decision. In November, the court overruled Van Riper and overturned the verdicts. The indictments against the other defendants were dropped. Emboldened by the Supreme Court decision, Newark's communists returned to militancy. In January 1931, they held demonstrations on the lawn in front of City Hall. In early January, 100 communists, among them women and children, gathered on the lawn of City Hall carrying signs and shouting charges of graft and corruption. They demanded work and food. 1,000 spectators swelled the crowd. 20 detectives tried to break up the meeting. A free-for-all broke out and police reserves were called out. After a demonstrator reportedly took a swing at Deputy Chief John Harris, police attacked the organizers with blackjacks, injuring 3 men. Mounted police charged into the crowd and scattered it. In a 2008 interview I conducted, Lucille Brodkin recalled the day. It was snowing outside. My mother bundled up my sister and me. It was early in the morning. We took a bus downtown. My mother told us we were going to a demonstration. We had heard about these from both our parents and were very excited. When we got to City Hall, my mother was handed a sign and we joined the crowd marching in front of City Hall. My mother and all the protesters were yelling. I don't remember what. Police were pushing the demonstrators in all directions, but my mother and the others stood their ground. All of a sudden, large horses, ridden by policemen, rode into the crowd. My mother grabbed our hands. I was terrified. My mother shouted, "Shame on you," to the assailants. A policeman grabbed her and said, "Lady, you have a big mouth," and arrested her. My sister and I panicked, but my mother asked Ida Langer to take us home and look after us. 12 demonstrators were arrested, including Rebecca Brodkin and Samuel Blumenthal, Lottie Blumenthal's father. Public Safety Director Egan prohibited further City Hall demonstrations. Nevertheless, another was announced. Police Chief McCrell denied the permit and declared, "No hunger march to City Hall. No demonstration at City Hall. No speaking at City Hall. I will see to it that no such things are done." The second City Hall meeting was the same as the first, except this time the police were more brutal in breaking up the march. Mounted police again entered the battle, dispersed the crowd, arrested 6 communists. But during this one, Saul Stark suffered a fractured skull, and Bernard Rosansky's ribs were broken when a horse trampled him. The Scottsboro case was a famous case in American history. It was about 9 young men who were arrested for allegedly raping a white woman, 2 white women. It was a frame-up and they were sentenced eventually to the electric chair, and this became another cause célèbre. The Scottsboro case was the reason Jack David and his best friend Jimmy Friedman joined the Communist Party. When I interviewed Jack in 1997, he told me, Jimmy and I were horrified, and we constantly discussed this travesty of justice. During the summer, we were walking in Weequahic Park discussing Scottsboro when we passed the tennis courts and saw a group of people our age engaged in a game. The scene was an epiphany for us. Here were young people unconcerned about real life in America, oblivious to our country's injustices. Then and there we made a pact to join the Communist Party, a fight for a better world where Scottsboro would not occur. In 1932, Jack David was summoned to the office of Captain John A. Brady of the 4th Precinct. Jack knew that his uncle Joe Mann, a bar owner, former political boss of the 3rd Ward, and the first Jewish freeholder, was Brady's political godfather and was responsible for Brady's rapid rise through the ranks. Brady warned Jack, "Stop propagandizing blacks in Newark." The captain hesitated to make sure his warning had sunk in. Then he continued, "Your uncle was good to me. I'll get you a job here in City Hall." Brady made a phone call and told Jack to go downstairs and take the civil service exam. Jack said, "How do you know I'm going to pass?" Brady replied, "Don't worry, you will." Jack declined the offer and remained a communist until he died 9 years ago.
Wow.
Finally recognizing the potential of the Newark Party, the Central Committee brought a full-time organizer, Rebecca Grecht, in May 1932 and established Newark District Number 14 as independent. Grecht's first report to the party's National Committee complained that the district had no contacts in Newark's manufacturing industries and that its work with the unemployed was haphazard and practically at an end. She claimed she had begun work in Newark's black neighborhoods and had staged a successful eviction action. She took credit for 6 new black party members. She also criticized Newark communists for their willingness to heed Egan's order not to hold street meetings. As a result of Grecht's efforts, 3 election rallies were held during the summer at Charlton and Spruce Streets in the center of the black 3rd Ward. The police used nightsticks to break up all 3 and arrested 23 communists. It is no wonder that in her next report to the Central Committee, Grecht complained that it was more difficult than ever to carry on work in Newark because of police terror. She bemoaned that a number of comrades have grown apathetic because of their fear of arrest. The Communist Party was unable to get their presidential candidate, William Foster, and vice presidential candidate, James W. Ford, on the 1932 ballot. They were unable to get Foster and Ford on in almost any states, including New Jersey. However, because Foster was the first black on a presidential ticket, he came to Newark to a full house of 800 supporters at Kruger Auditorium. According to Levine, a full house carried Comrade Ford on their shoulders onto the stage as young communists toting banners, singing revolutionary songs led the way. At the end of 1932, Grecht reported to the Central Committee that the Newark Communist Party membership was now approximately 300. On the labor front, she said that there were no party cells in industry and added that during the last 6 months there had been no strikes in the district. However, a deadly strike began in February 1933 when Local 25 of the International Fur Workers Union made another unsuccessful attempt to organize A. Hollander and Sons fur processing plant. Morris Langer led the effort, assisted by Dominic Fliani. On February 27th, Natalie Bolero, 26 years old, a striking employee, was shot twice in the back at point-blank range by his friend and co-worker Rocco Capo, a non-striker. Bolero was a communist, Capo was not. There were 5 eyewitnesses to the murder at the 14th Ward Social Club on 15th and Littleton Avenues. The 2 had fought earlier over the strike, and Capo left the club and returned with a pistol. More than 100 communists attended the March 3rd funeral. Fliani tried to address the crowd at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery on South Orange Avenue, but the superintendent prevented him. Police ordered the group outside. On the street, Fliani made brief comments on condemning Hollander. In a speech the following day before 150 strikers, Morris Langer predicted that Bolero's murder would not drive them back to the Hollander plant. 3 weeks later, Langer was fatally injured when a bomb attached to his ignition went off as he started his car. Langer lingered for 3 days before he succumbed to blood poisoning. Over 1,000 joined the funeral procession, which marched to Military Park where an additional 1,200 people assembled. A large banner over the workers read, "The pelts of the Hollander firm died in workers' blood." Among the 7 speakers were Dominic Fliani and Rebecca Grecht. According to the Freiheit, the large mass swore with raised fists to uphold the battle that Langer gave his life for. Langer's killers were never found and the crime is still unsolved. Capo, Bolero's murderer, fled Newark to New Orleans after the murder. However, he was arrested for a liquor violation and the FBI identified his prints. He was extradited to Newark in early May and brought before Judge Daniel Brennan, no relation to Commissioner William Brennan. He pleaded not guilty and was held without bail. His trial was set for June 5th. During the intervening 11 days, there was no report on the case in the news media, the sole exception being S.D. Levine's, in the Yiddish language, Freiheit. He claimed a deal had been made. It had been. The prosecutor recommended a plea of non-vote, and Judge Brennan accepted it. With this plea, Capo admitted his guilt, avoided a trial, and in effect threw himself at the mercy of the court. According to Levine, this non-vote plea meant that the state parole board could parole Capo before his term expired. 1 week later, Brennan sentenced Capo to 12 to 15 years. Levine was correct, and the parole board released Capo after 9 years. As a coda, I quote Judge Daniel Brennan's comment after sentencing Rocco Capo. Said Brennan, "I wish to explain this comparatively lenient sentence. The defendant apparently was terrorized by a communistic group. That is a challenge to our entire social order. I do not condone what he did, but I must consider this provocation." That's it. Thank you. Excuse me?
What about the Communist Party today?
Communist Party today is mainly a group of survivors in their 80s and 90s, plus probably 1,000 younger people who were divided into a number of different small communist sects. They're sects. Dr. Parsnett?
I remember those times very turbulent, and just curious to know, you've written about the Nazis in Newark. What was the relationship with the Nazi parties and people like Dr. Kalb and the communists? Was Kalb a communist?
Well, Kalb was hardly a communist. Kalb was very much to the right. However, there was cooperation between the communists and the groups that were anti-communists, the Minutemen. That was told to me by Milton Ritz, who was a famous leftist in Newark, that they coordinated activities in raiding some Nazi events. However, that only lasted to the Nazi-Soviet pact.
Just one other comment. I remember these days well, as I said. You didn't discuss really the ideology of the communists, and there was a very strong intellectual force for communism, particularly this is what they thought was the social revolutions in Russia from the 1917 revolution until the rise of Hitler. And the ideology was very attractive to young people. And the Young Communist League was very attractive to us when I was a kid because of all the great things they told you about the egalitarian societies and getting rid of capitalism and the workers would own industry and all that sort of stuff. It was a very powerful movement, and you just
No, I sort of mentioned, I did mention the Jack London Club, which was for intellectuals. It was for high school and college students who wanted to discuss great books. And they were steered into Marxism. They were idealists, and many of them were recruited into the Communist Party. It started off, many of them were idealists. But don't forget, if you wanted to become a communist, there were two things. First of all, you had to recognize the Soviet Union as your homeland, not America. Your first loyalty was the Soviet Union. And second of all, if you belonged to the party, you absolutely had to follow party discipline. If you didn't follow party discipline, you were out. So it was very difficult to join. That's why I said there were only 220s, and by the end of the period, there were 300. Very difficult to be a communist because it required a tremendous leap of faith, a tremendous recalibrating of your ideology. No more questions? Yes, George.
What were the religious leaders preaching? Were priests like later Father Coughlin preaching against the communists, or were they rabbis preaching against it? Was it considered to be evil morally, or? Okay,
communism was denounced to one degree or another by all major religions. However, the Catholic Church in Newark was virulently anti-communist, and one of the great manifestations of that was that the Communist Party in Newark could never organize an Irish branch. Continuously through the 1930s, I've seen the documents, they tried to set up an Irish Communist Party group. They couldn't do it. There were a few individual Irish, but not many. The Italians were much less religious than the Irish, and the Italian priests were a little more to the left than the Irish priests. As far as the Jews, they were very conservative. Most of them were Republicans, even though they had a lot of communists within them because of the idealistic features of communism. And the furthest to the left were the high Protestant denominations. The Episcopalians and the Presbyterians, although anti-communist, were the most liberal from the point of view of social issues.
Ron, why did they not focus on local issues, improvement of housing and education in Newark during that period?
Well, education during the Depression was not a big factor. In the 20s, the education establishment grew in Newark. They built high schools, they built grammar schools. Once the Depression came, education took a back burner to everything. Jobs became the only factor. And the overriding issue was the Depression once 1930.
A quick geography question. Where was Laurel Gardens?
Laurel Gardens,
Springfield Avenue.
Springfield Avenue, down, sort of a little up from downtown. It was
Oh, it's a great venue for wrestling.
yes, that's right.
Boxing.
And boxing.
Hey, one question. First question is about the archive. Could you just tell us, is this a newspaper-based, what's your primary archive? You also mentioned that you had interviewed a couple of them. So is it oral interviews and then newspapers? Are there personal papers? If so, do they have personal papers or diaries of any of those black communists? And then the second question is about the Depression period, because the Depression, I don't know, it's funny how people characterize it. Does it extend till 37, 39? Like, when does the Depression end? And it seems like the bulk of what you have. Okay, all right. It seems like the bulk of what you have is the early 30s and the late 20s. And I was wondering about what happens, around 34, 35 during the Popular Front, because, I told you I interviewed Lottie Blumenthal before she died, and she told me that the biggest mistake of the CPUSA at that time was that they didn't fuse more with the Urban League and the mass organizations, and that they were too sectarian and to the left. So did you notice whether or not there was any evidence of communists sort of going into like the Urban League and organizations like that during the Popular Front?
The Urban League was, as far as the communists went, was a traitor, a class traitor, and Urban League was thought to be traitorous to blacks, and NAACP also. As far as my sources, which is a good question, starting with the first record of history, newspapers, but also a lot the American Communist Archive, which started in the Library of Congress. They got it from Moscow after the revolution in 1989. Now they have a copy at Tenement in New York, was a treasure trove of information for my last book and this chapter of my next book. And also interviews, some secondary sources, but not too many. What secondary sources would talk about the Newark Communist Party? None did. And in personal interviews, for my first book, I was able to get a lot of personal interviews. For this book, when I'm talking about an earlier period, before 1930, before Franklin Roosevelt's term, they were all dead except a few. Another question? I can't see that far. Yes?
Yeah, look, thank you. The history that you recited seemed to be fairly consistent, except for that one period from 1926 to 29. There was just massive repression of the communists by all sectors of the government, whether it be the police, the courts, et cetera, et cetera. And it sounds like from what the other thing that you said regarding the warnings that were given to the leaders, that the city leaders seem to be particularly afraid of what they described as propagandizing, but we could probably see in retrospect was actually an attempt to unite white and black workers together who had the same common interest. What is your sense of why the city and its institutions were so afraid of the communists?
Well, they're afraid of the communists because the communists would have done away with the municipal, county, statewide governments and set up Soviets on the Russian model. So it was, they were revolutionary. They were afraid. I would have gone into it, but I didn't have the time. But a very interesting point, the blacks and the communists. The blacks made no effort at all to recruit communists to their party until the Depression. And then they tried to recruit them, and they were what you would call trying to propagandize them, but to use them to build their base and to use them for demonstrations. But the reality was that at the end of the era, other than a few blacks in the state, the communists were totally unsuccessful in the black community. The blacks weren't interested. And that was they knew it for sure.
Was there any reason why?
The blacks in Newark, most of them had come into Newark from the deep south between the end of World War I and the Depression. I told you it started, there were 17,000 by the 1940 census. There were 38,500 blacks in Newark. Most of these had come straight up from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, into Newark. They were, for the most part, 2 generations away from slavery. How could they be interested? They were trying to survive. There weren't jobs for them. what were they interested in communism for? I mean, they needed food to eat, they needed to have shelter. The communist ideal did not make any sense to them, and they didn't listen, for the most part, to the communist propaganda. Arnold?
How strong was the Socialist Party in Newark during that time? And what was the relationship
Good
between
question.
the communists
Good
and
question.
socialists?
Good question. At every convention, communist convention, the big foes weren't the capitalists. The big foes were the socialists. The most hated foe, always, of the Communist Party, not just in Newark, but all over, were the socialists. That was their main competition. When the communists would have 100 at a rally in Newark, the socialists would have 500. In the cases of the ballot where the communists would poll 300, 500 votes, the socialists would get 8,000, 9,000. The socialists were very healthy, and the combination of the two helped move things along. But the communists hated the socialists, no cooperation except for a brief time when they tried, and it didn't work out during the Popular Front. Yes?
Yeah, a comment and a question. I'm just about this whole question of the extent to which African Americans might or might not have been sort of won over to the communist cause. It's interesting that in New York City they certainly did achieve a significant critical mass. And people know Mark Mason's book about communists in Harlem during the Depression. I'm just, so obviously there's a different particularity here. What I was struck by is that a woman was brought in to head up the party work, I guess in the early 1930s. And I was just wondering what you've been able to find out about the role that women were playing in leadership in the party, secondary leadership, the extent to which any of the organizing that was going on in factories where women may have been working.
Wonderful point. The Workers' Party, which started in 1919, all men. The Communist Party in Newark, through a good part of the 20s, almost all men. The only time they started having women, there were two types of women that joined the Communist Party in Newark. One was survivors from the 1905 Russian Revolution. A whole cohort of people came over, both Russians, national Ukrainians, they came over together. These women, when they came to Newark and in other major cities, formed a group. It was called the Mothers Group. And the Mothers Group were a group of women that supported the Communist Party from the time it was established in 1919. They were still meeting in Newark in 1940, 1941. Now, for leadership roles, supposedly the Communist Party was egalitarian. In the beginning, the Central Committee, all the party apparatchiks, they were men. But slowly but surely, there were some early communist women that were very influential, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, for one. But in Newark, they brought in Rebecca Grecht, was the first woman that was a leader. However, eventually, Martha Stone, in that same period, she had just started her career with the Passaic wool strike, and Martha Asher, by the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s, was the communist leader in Newark and in New Jersey. So the women did come to the fore, and as time came on, particularly in the 50s, I would say by the 50s, the women's component in the Newark Communist Party was substantial. Yes, Gil?
Yeah, I hope you'll continue the story into the 40s and 50s, because I think it seems that the party survived in pretty good shape after the Second World War, and I was wondering if perhaps you might measure its influence even in the 30s beyond the people who were members. I think that's one of the answers. There was not only the Scottsboro case, the Passaic strike, but they had such events as the Spanish Civil War, which mobilized really much larger numbers of people than the party membership, just as the socialists did in different ways. And I can also add that the papers of Lottie Blumenthal's husband, David Gordon, who was a volunteer from Newark in the Spanish Civil War, are also at the town library. But you have to take these kind of larger factors into consideration, I think.
No question about it. The number of sympathizers was always infinitely larger than the number of members. I told you how hard it was to be a member, to accept party discipline. Anytime the Communist Party said something, you obeyed that. If you didn't, you were out of the party. And so people could be sympathizers and be more or less independent, but at the same time follow the ideology and be a sympathizer. And as far as New York, I just want to, someone had brought up the fact that New York did have a black communist presence. Part of that was that New York and Harlem in particular had intellectual ferment. They produced first-class intellects in Harlem, a mass, a critical mass. And there was an appeal. Once there was a critical mass, there was a certain appeal to intellectuals, black intellectuals, that communism had. We can look at some of the great writers. You know, you can look at Robeson, you can look at Richard Wright. You know, it was...
Langston Hughes.
Excuse me?
And Black Renaissance.
Yes. Yes. So in other words, in Newark you didn't have that critical mass. And I said that the population was overwhelmingly immigrants from the South. Yeah,
Just one more point on that, though. There also was a large black membership of the Communist Party in Alabama. That's documented in the book Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly. And so I just want to come back to the point you made before about, you know, blacks coming up from the South and not really seeing anything in the Communist Party for them. I mean, in fact, in Alabama, there was mass organizing among black and white sharecroppers against the effects of the Depression. And these were people that had nothing and probably didn't have much of an education. And they also didn't have the intellectual, the intellectual heavyweightness of, say, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, and all these others. So I guess I beg to differ on that point.
No, we're not differing in this. I'm talking about Newark, which had its distinctive
No, I just meant your
characteristics.
general statement.
Yes, I.
Related to that question, this is focusing on Newark, with the certain distinct characteristics of Newark, which created a slightly different mix of who was involved, who wasn't involved. I'm thinking, was this to a great degree an immigrant and children of immigrant phenomenon? Granted, you only went to a certain period of time.
Originally, yes, exactly. Immigrants, children of immigrants, right up until the late 30s. And then you get people, parts of the general population. And from an ethnic point of view, the majority of the party, it started off as Slavic in 1919, 1920, 1921, 22. Once the party came out in the open, more Jews gravitated towards it. The first Central Committee in Newark in 1932, I have the minutes from the first meeting, there were 10 people on the presidium, because I remember it was split, 5 Italians, 5 Jews. No one else.
There'll be opportunity for conversation, but before we do that, I do want to remind you, if you want to know about our future programs, make sure that you fill out one of these slips. I have them here, or those should be on the table back there. And at the risk of mental whiplash, William Penniston, trying to avoid throwing away a lot of things at the museum, has brought a couple issues of the Museum Quarterly, one about costumes and portraits of Newarkers, and the other about movie making in New Jersey. So if you want those, they're on several out there. Pick one up on the way out. Thank you so much for coming.